The hunger gnawed at Caroline Newsom's stomach as she collapsed on the church steps, her torn skirts pooling around her like a wilted flower. Texas, 1876, was not kind to a woman alone, especially one who had lost everything to a single catastrophic turn of fate. Miss, are you all right?" A deep voice broke through her fog of exhaustion. Caroline tried to focus on the figure before her, the sun creating a halo behind his broad-shouldered silhouette. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, not since the stagecoach robbery that had taken everything: her money, her luggage, her last hope for a new beginning in Willow Creek. Her voice cracked, pride warring with desperation. "I'm fine, thank you," but she wasn't fine. The world tilted dangerously, and Caroline felt herself swaying. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her. When her vision cleared, she found herself looking into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a well-worn cowboy hat. "You don't look fine to me, miss." His voice was gentle with a hint of Texas drawl. "When's the last time you ate?" She couldn't bring herself to answer, shame coloring her cheeks. The stranger seemed to understand without words. He disappeared momentarily, leaving Caroline struggling to remain upright on the steps of Willow Creek's modest white church. When he returned, he carried a cloth bundle. Kneeling before her, he unwrapped it to reveal several thick slices of bread, still warm from the oven, and a small wedge of cheese. "Here," he said, placing the food in her trembling hands. "Eat slow now." Caroline wanted to refuse, to maintain what little dignity she had left, but hunger won out. She took a small bite of bread, then another. "Thank you," she whispered between careful mouthfuls. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for repayment. I'm Daniel James," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face. "But folks around here just call me Dusty." Caroline didn't know it then, but the name that filled her hands along with the bread would soon fill her heart as well. As she ate, Caroline tried not to devour the food too quickly. Her body craved it desperately, but she maintained what composure she could. This man, Dusty, had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and she wouldn't repay him by acting like a starving animal, even if that's exactly what she was. "Caroline Newsom," she offered once she'd taken the edge off her hunger. I was headed to Willow Creek to take a position as a schoolteacher. Dusty settled beside her on the church steps, keeping a respectful distance. "Schoolteacher, huh? Town's been waiting on you. Heard some talk about the stage being robbed. That was your coach," Caroline nodded, swallowing hard. "They took everything. My trunk, my savings, everything." She'd left Boston with such hope, fleeing the scandal of a broken engagement and the whispers that followed. Now she was here destitute and alone. "Sheriff's been tracking those bandits for weeks," Dusty said, his expression hardening. "Third coach they've hit this month." Will they catch them?" Caroline asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Sooner or later. Thing about outlaws is they always make mistakes eventually." He studied her for a moment. "You got anywhere to stay tonight, Miss Newsom?" Caroline looked away. "The school board was supposed to arrange accommodations, but I was meant to check in with them upon arrival. I've been too ashamed to present myself like this." She gestured to her dusty, torn traveling dress, once navy blue and respectable, now a sorry sight after days on the trail. Dusty stood, offering his hand. "Well, I reckon we should get you over to Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. She's on the school board and she's got a room set aside for you. Once you're settled, we can sort the rest." Caroline hesitated before taking his hand. "Mr. James, I have no money, not a single cent. Town's been pooling funds for the new teacher for months. Your room and board is already paid up through the first month." His smile was reassuring. "Folks here have been mighty eager to get some proper schooling for their young'uns." Relief washed over Caroline like a cool breeze. She allowed him to help her to her feet, though her legs were still unsteady. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for more than just the information. "For the bread, for your kindness." "It's nothing," Dusty replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Just being neighborly." As they walked slowly down Willow Creek's main street, Caroline became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Several townspeople stopped to stare, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Don't mind them," Dusty said quietly. "News travels fast in a small town. They're just curious." A woman emerged from the general store, her sharp eyes immediately landing on Caroline. She hurried over, her expression a mixture of concern and interest. "Daniel James, is this our new schoolteacher?" she asked, appraising Caroline from head to toe. "Yes, madam. Miss Caroline Newsom, meet Mrs. Peterson. She runs the boarding house where you'll be staying, Mrs." Peterson was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Caroline of her former headmistress. "My goodness, child, you look like you've been through the ringer. The stage robbery, I presume, Mrs." Peterson clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Well, come along. We'll get you settled with a hot bath and a proper meal." Caroline glanced at Dusty, suddenly reluctant to part from the first friendly face she'd encountered. "I'll check in on you tomorrow, Miss Newsom," he said, seeming to understand her hesitation. "Make sure you're getting on all right." "That's very kind, but you've done more than enough nonsense," Mrs. Peterson interrupted. "Dusty here is the most reliable man in Willow Creek. If he says he'll look in on you, you can set your watch by it." With that, Mrs. Peterson took Caroline's arm and began steering her toward a 2-story clapboard house at the end of the street. Caroline looked back once to see Dusty watching them go, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. The boarding house was clean and modestly furnished, with polished wooden floors and simple curtains at the windows. Mrs. Peterson showed Caroline to a small but comfortable room on the second floor. "Bathrooms down the hall," she explained. "I'll have hot water brought up directly. Dinner's at 6 sharp. Don't worry about coming down if you're not feeling up to it. I can bring a tray up for you tonight." Caroline surveyed the room. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the main street. It was humble, but after days of sleeping rough, it seemed like luxury. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I don't know what I would have done." "Now, none of that," the older woman said briskly. "We take care of our own in Willow Creek, and you're one of us now. The school term doesn't start for another week, so you have time to recover and prepare." After Mrs. Peterson left, Caroline sank onto the bed, emotions overwhelming her. She'd been so close to complete despair on those church steps. Now, thanks to a stranger's kindness, she had food in her stomach, a roof over her head, and perhaps a chance to start again. Her thoughts drifted to Dusty James, with his gentle manner and striking blue eyes. There had been something solid about him, something trustworthy that went beyond his act of charity. Caroline wasn't naive, she knew better than to put too much stock in first impressions. Her failed engagement to Edward back in Boston had taught her that painful lesson. Still, she couldn't help but feel grateful for Dusty's timely appearance. As promised, hot water for a bath arrived shortly, carried up by Mrs. Peterson's teenage son and daughter. The girl, Annie, lingered to help Caroline unpin her matted hair. "You have such pretty hair, Miss Newsom," Annie said admiringly as she gently worked through the tangles with a comb. Like copper pennies in the sun, Caroline smiled at the poetic description of her auburn locks. "Thank you, Annie. It's a bit of a mess right now." "Mama sent up some of her rosemary soap and hair rinse," Annie continued, "and she said to tell you she's put some clothes out that might fit you until your things can be replaced." The kindness of these strangers continued to astound Caroline. "Your mother is very generous," Annie grinned. "She's just excited to have a real teacher in town. I'm 16 now, but I still want to come to school sometimes, if that's all right. I love books something fierce." "Of course," Caroline assured her. "Education shouldn't have an age limit." After Annie left, Caroline sank into the steaming bath, letting the warm water soothe her aching body. As she scrubbed away the dirt of her journey, she felt herself beginning to wash away some of the despair as well. Perhaps Willow Creek could be the fresh start she needed after all. The next morning, Caroline woke to sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment, she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She was in Willow Creek in Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, and she had survived. After dressing in a borrowed calico dress that was a bit loose but clean, Caroline made her way downstairs. Mrs. Peterson was in the dining room, supervising as Annie set the table for breakfast. "Ah, there you are. You look much better today, my dear," Mrs. Peterson said approvingly. "How did you sleep?" "Like the dead," Caroline admitted. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality." "Sit, sit. You need a proper breakfast, then we'll head over to meet with the rest of the school board." The breakfast was hearty eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy, and strong coffee. Caroline ate with appreciation, though she was careful not to overdo it after days of near starvation. As they finished their meal, a knock came at the front door. Annie hurried to answer it, and moments later, Dusty James appeared in the dining room doorway, hat in hand. "Morning, ladies," he greeted them, his eyes finding Caroline's. "Miss Newsom, you're looking much improved today." Caroline felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Mr. James, good morning. Dusty, have you had breakfast?" "There's plenty," Mrs. Peterson offered. "Already ate, thank you kindly." He shifted his weight, seeming almost nervous. "Actually, I've come with some news. Sheriff caught one of the bandits who robbed the stage, found him spending money in the saloon over in Red Rock. They recovered some of the stolen goods." Caroline's heart leaped. "My things." "Some," Dusty confirmed. "Your trunk wasn't among what they found, but there was a carpet bag with ladies' articles that might be yours. Sheriff asked if you could come identify it." "Of course," Caroline said, rising from her chair. "Right away." Mrs. Peterson reached for her shawl. "I'll accompany you. The school board meeting isn't until 11. The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town. Inside, Sheriff Tate, a weathered man with a silver mustache, greeted them cordially. "Miss Newsom, sorry about your troubles. Dusty here told me what happened." He gestured to a small carpet bag on his desk. This looked familiar. Caroline's heart soared as she recognized her traveling bag. Yes, that's mine." She rushed forward, opening it to find her hairbrush, a small jewelry case containing her mother's locket, a few handkerchiefs, and the book of poetry she'd been reading on the stagecoach. "It's not much," the sheriff acknowledged, "but we're still tracking the others. The man we caught isn't talking yet, but he will." Caroline clutched the bag to her chest. "It's more than I hoped for, thank you." "Don't thank me. Dusty's the one who recognized the description of your bag and thought to check Red Rock." Caroline turned to Dusty, who was leaning against the doorframe, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention. "You did that for me," he shrugged. "Wasn't much. Just mentioned it to the sheriff when I heard about the arrest." But Caroline knew it was more than that. He'd gone out of his way to help a stranger, and not for the first time. After leaving the sheriff's office, Mrs. Peterson announced she needed to stop at the general store before the school board meeting. "Dusty, would you mind showing Miss Newsom around town a bit?" It would be good for her to get her bearings. "Be happy to," Dusty agreed, offering Caroline his arm. "If you're feeling up to a short walk, Miss Newsom," Caroline slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength of him. "I am, thank you." As they strolled down the main street, Dusty pointed out the various establishments. The general store, the bank, the blacksmith shop, the small hotel, and finally, the schoolhouse at the edge of town. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with a bell tower, freshly painted white with green shutters. A split-rail fence enclosed a yard where children could play during recess. "It's not fancy," Dusty said as they approached, "but it's solid. Town built it just 3 years ago." "It's perfect," Caroline breathed, imagining herself teaching there. After the uncertainty of the past few days, the sight of the schoolhouse represented hope and purpose. Dusty produced a key from his pocket. "Mrs. Peterson asked me to let you have a look inside. Thought you might want to see where you'll be teaching." The interior was clean and well organized, with rows of desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they were only half filled. A blackboard hung behind the teacher's desk, and a pot-bellied stove stood ready for the coming winter months. Caroline walked slowly to the front of the room, running her hand along the smooth surface of the teacher's desk. "How many students will there be?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 16, Dusty replied, watching her from the doorway. "Some can only come when farm work allows, especially the older boys." Caroline nodded, understanding. "That's common in rural areas." She turned to face him. "Mr. James Dusty, what do you do?" "In Willow Creek, I mean," he smiled slightly. "Bit of everything. I have a small ranch about 3 miles outside town, nothing fancy, just enough cattle to make a living. I help Sheriff Tate sometimes when he needs an extra deputy. Do some carpentry work when things are slow." "You built this schoolhouse?" "Helped," he corrected. "Whole town pitched in." There was a modesty about him that Caroline found refreshing after the pretentiousness of Boston society. Dusty James seemed comfortable in his own skin without need for posturing or grand declarations. "Well, I'm grateful for it," she said sincerely. "And for your kindness yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me on those church steps." Dusty's expression grew serious. "Someone would have helped you. Folks around here are good people." "Perhaps, but it was you who did." Caroline met his gaze steadily. "And I won't forget that." Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. But before either could speak, the schoolhouse door opened wider and Mrs. Peterson bustled in. "There you are. The board members are gathering at the hotel for our meeting." She looked around approvingly. "What do you think of your schoolhouse, Miss Newsom?" "It's wonderful," Caroline replied honestly. "I can't wait to begin teaching." "That's the spirit." "Now come along, we shouldn't keep everyone waiting." As they walked to the hotel, Dusty fell into step beside Caroline. "I'll leave you ladies to your meeting. Got some business to attend to." Caroline felt a twinge of disappointment. "Will I see you again?" "Count on it," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. Willow Creek isn't big enough to avoid anyone for long. The school board meeting went better than Caroline could have hoped. The 5 members, Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Garrett from the bank, Reverend Walsh from the church, Dr. Bailey, and Mr. Thompson, who owned the general store, were unanimously pleased to have her, despite her bedraggled arrival. "The stagecoach robbery was not your fault, my dear," Reverend Walsh assured her. "We're just thankful you arrived safely." They discussed the curriculum, the students, and practical matters like her salary and living arrangements. It was agreed that she would continue to board with Mrs. Peterson, with the town covering her room and board for the first month, until she received her first payment. "Now, about your personal situation," Mr. Thompson said delicately. "Dusty mentioned you lost all your belongings in the robbery." Caroline flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, though the sheriff did recover my small traveling bag this morning." "Well, we can't have our schoolteacher without proper attire," Mrs. Peterson declared. "My Annie is handy with a needle, but she can't work miracles overnight." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "My wife and I would like to extend store credit to you, Miss Newsom. You can select fabric and notions and whatever else you need to be deducted from your future salary in reasonable installments." "That's very generous," Caroline said, touched by their consideration. "Not at all," Mr. Thompson replied. "It's practical. Can't have the children thinking their teacher is a vagabond, now can we?" There was gentle laughter around the table, and Caroline found herself joining in, the tension of the past days finally beginning to ease. After the meeting concluded, Mrs. Peterson accompanied Caroline to the general store, where Mrs. Thompson, a plump, cheerful woman, helped her select fabrics for several new dresses. "Annie and I will help you sew," Mrs. Peterson promised. "Between the 3 of us, we'll have you properly outfitted in no time." By late afternoon, Caroline was exhausted but hopeful. She returned to the boarding house with her arms full of packages, fabric, thread, buttons, a new hairbrush, and other essentials that Mrs. Thompson had insisted she needed immediately. As they approached the boarding house, Caroline spotted a familiar figure on the porch. Dusty rose from the rocking chair as they drew near. "Ladies," he greeted them. "Successful shopping trip, I see." "Mr. Thompson was very generous," Caroline replied, shifting her packages. "Here, let me help you with those." Dusty took the bulk of her parcels, following the women inside. Mrs. Peterson disappeared into the kitchen, calling, "I'll start dinner." "Dusty, you're welcome to stay if you like." Left alone in the front parlor, Caroline felt suddenly shy. "Thank you for your help again, Mr. James." "Dusty," he reminded her gently. "And actually, I came by for a reason." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small object. "Found this in town today, thought it might be yours." He held out a small silver hairpin with a pearl on the end. Caroline gasped, recognizing it immediately. "My hairpin, but how?" "Sheriff found it on the floor of his office after you left. Must have fallen out of your carpet bag." Caroline took the pin, her fingers brushing against his palm. "It was my mother's," she explained softly. "One of the few things I have left of her." Dusty's expression was gentle. "Figured it might be important. It is. Thank you." Caroline looked up at him, struck again by the kindness in his blue eyes. There was something compelling about Dusty James, something that drew her to him despite her wariness of men after Edward's betrayal. "Miss Newsom, Caroline," Dusty said, his voice lower now. "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to church on Sunday. Being new in town, thought you might appreciate a familiar face." The invitation surprised her, though not unpleasantly. "That would be lovely, thank you." His smile warmed her more than it should have. "Good, that's good." He glanced toward the kitchen where they could hear Mrs. Peterson humming as she worked. "I should be going, got chores waiting at the ranch. You won't stay for dinner? Better not. But I'll see you Sunday, if not before." After he left, Caroline stood in the parlor, the silver hairpin clutched in her hand, a strange fluttering in her chest. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. Too soon after Edward, too soon after arriving in this town, too soon to be feeling anything for a man she barely knew. And yet, when she thought of Dusty James, of bread in her empty hands and kindness, when she needed it most, she couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just perhaps, fate had guided her to those church steps for a reason. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Caroline, Mrs. Peterson, and Annie worked diligently on sewing new clothes. With Annie's skilled help, Caroline soon had 2 serviceable day dresses and was working on a third, more formal dress for church and special occasions. Caroline also spent time at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons and familiarizing herself with the available books. The school library was modest, but Mr. Garrett from the bank had promised to write to his brother in St. Louis about sending more books when possible. Though she kept busy, Caroline found her thoughts often drifting to Dusty. She hadn't seen him since he'd returned her hairpin, and despite her best efforts to remain practical, she found herself looking forward to Sunday with unexpected eagerness. On Saturday afternoon, as Caroline was helping Mrs. Peterson in the kitchen, they heard the front door open and Annie's excited voice greeting someone. Moments later, Annie appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes bright. "Miss Newsom, Dusty's here to see you. He's got something in the wagon." Wiping her hands on her apron, Caroline followed Annie to the front of the house. Dusty stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking somewhat nervous. "Afternoon, Miss Newsom," he greeted her. "Good afternoon, Dusty. Annie says you have something to show me." He nodded, gesturing toward a wagon parked in front of the house. "If you have a minute." Curious, Caroline stepped outside. In the back of the wagon sat a trunk. Her trunk, she realized with a gasp. "My trunk? But how?" "Sheriff caught another of the bandits this morning," Dusty explained, helping her down the porch steps. "Found a cache of stolen goods in an abandoned line shack about 10 miles out. Your name was on the trunk." Caroline rushed to the wagon, hardly daring to believe it. The brass nameplate on the front confirmed its C. Newsom engraved in flowing script. Her father had given her this trunk when she left for teaching college 4 years ago. "Is it intact?" she asked, running her hands over the wooden surface. "Looks like it. Lock still secure." Dusty produced a small key from his pocket. "Sheriff found this on the bandit, thought it might fit. With trembling fingers, Caroline took the key and inserted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the lid lifted to reveal her neatly packed belongings: dresses, undergarments, books, teaching materials, and the small wooden box containing her most precious keepsakes. "It's all here," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "Everything." Dusty smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Thought you'd want it right away. Sheriff said I could bring it over." "Thank you," Caroline said, impulsively grabbing his hand. "Thank you so much." His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "Happy to do it, Mrs. Peterson appeared on the porch, beaming at the sight. "Well now, that's a piece of good fortune. Dusty, bring that trunk inside for Miss Newsom." With practiced ease, Dusty lifted the heavy trunk from the wagon and carried it into the house and up the stairs to Caroline's room. She followed, still stunned by this unexpected turn of events. "Where would you like it?" he asked, slightly breathless from the exertion. "By the wall, please." Caroline watched as he positioned the trunk, then straightened, wiping his brow. "I can't believe I have my things back." "Bandits probably figured jewelry and money were the only valuables," Dusty observed. "Lucky for you they didn't just dump everything." Caroline nodded, kneeling to open the trunk again. "Most of this wouldn't mean much to anyone else but to me." She pulled out a faded daguerreotype in a silver frame, her parents on their wedding day. "These are irreplaceable." Dusty watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Family's important." "Do you have family nearby?" Caroline asked, realizing how little she knew about him. A shadow crossed his face. "Not anymore. Parents passed years ago, had a brother, but he died at Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Caroline said softly, understanding the loss all too well. Her own parents had died within months of each other, her father from heart failure and her mother from pneumonia shortly after. "I lost my parents 3 years ago." Dusty nodded, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "Makes the things they left behind all the more precious." "Yes," Caroline agreed, carefully replacing the photograph. "It does." They remained there for a moment, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Mrs. Peterson's voice called up the stairs, breaking the spell. "Caroline, Annie needs help with the pie crust." "I should go," Caroline said, reluctantly closing the trunk lid. "And I've got work waiting at the ranch." Dusty moved toward the door, then paused. "I'll come by around 10 tomorrow morning. For church, I'll be ready," Caroline promised. After he left, Caroline opened the trunk again, this time removing her best dress, a deep green wool with black piping that complemented her auburn hair. It would need pressing, but it was far better than the hastily sewn cotton dress she'd planned to wear to church. As she shook out the folds of the wool dress, Caroline tried to temper her rising excitement. It was only church, she reminded herself. Not a proper courtship or anything so formal. And yet, the thought of walking into the church on Dusty James's arm made her heart beat a little faster. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Caroline rose early, bathed, and dressed with particular care. The green wool dress fit as well as ever, and with her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style, secured with her mother's pearl hairpin, she felt more like herself than she had since the stagecoach robbery. Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly when Caroline came downstairs. "You look lovely, my dear, quite transformed." "Thank you," Caroline replied, accepting a cup of coffee. "It feels good to have my own things again." "I imagine so." Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled. "And I imagine Dusty James will think you look mighty fine as well." Caroline felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Peterson, really, Mr. James is simply being kind to a newcomer." "Of course he is," the older woman agreed with a knowing smile. "Dusty's always been a gentleman. But I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've never seen him bring a lady's hairpin all the way into town just to return it." Before Caroline could formulate a response, a knock came at the door. Promptly at 10 o'clock, just as he'd promised. Dusty stood on the porch, looking like a different man. Gone were the worn work clothes and dusty boots. Instead, he wore a clean black suit, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a stubborn lock still fell across his forehead. His hat, newer and less battered than his everyday one, was held respectfully in his hands. For a moment he seemed speechless at the sight of her. Then, recovering himself, he smiled. "Miss Newsom, you look very nice." "Thank you, Mr. James, so do you." Mrs. Peterson bustled past them. "You two can exchange compliments on the way to church. We don't want to be late for Reverend Walsh's sermon." The walk to church was pleasant, the late summer morning warm but not oppressive. Caroline was acutely aware of Dusty beside her, his arm occasionally brushing against hers as they navigated the uneven sidewalk. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice low so Mrs. Peterson, walking ahead with Annie, couldn't hear. "Very well, thank you." "It was wonderful to have my own nightgown and brush and books." Caroline smiled up at him. "I can't thank you enough for bringing my trunk. No need for thanks, just glad it worked out." He hesitated, then added, "You look different today, more settled?" "I feel more settled," Caroline admitted. "Having my possessions back makes Willow Creek feel more like home already." Something flickered in Dusty's eyes at the word home, but before he could respond, they arrived at the church. The small white building was already filling with townspeople, many of whom turned to look curiously at Caroline. Dusty seemed to sense her sudden nervousness. "Don't worry," he murmured. "They're just eager to meet their new teacher." Indeed, as they made their way inside, several people approached to introduce themselves. Caroline met so many names and faces that they began to blur together, though she did her best to remember parents of potential students. When they finally took their seats, Caroline found herself between Dusty and Mrs. Peterson, with Annie on her mother's other side. The church filled quickly, and soon Reverend Walsh ascended to the pulpit to begin the service. The sermon was on community and welcoming strangers, which Caroline suspected might have been chosen with her in mind. Throughout the service, she was keenly aware of Dusty beside her, his deep voice joining in the hymns, his solid presence reassuring in the sea of unfamiliar faces. After the service concluded, there was a social gathering on the church lawn. Women had brought pies, cakes, and sandwiches, and tables had been set up under the shade of a large oak tree. "This happens every Sunday after church," Dusty explained as he escorted Caroline toward the refreshment tables. "Gives folks a chance to catch up with each other." Caroline was immediately surrounded by curious townspeople, all eager to meet the new schoolteacher. Mothers introduced their children, fathers asked about the curriculum, and several elderly residents reminisced about teachers from their own school days. Throughout it all, Dusty remained nearby, occasionally rescuing her from particularly persistent questioners or bringing her refreshments. His attentiveness didn't go unnoticed. Caroline caught several knowing looks exchanged between the town matrons. "Miss Newsom," a voice called, and Caroline turned to see Mr. Thompson from the general store approaching with his wife. "We've been meaning to ask, do you play the piano?" "I do, yes," Caroline replied, "not exceptionally well, but adequately." Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands in delight. "Wonderful, our last teacher couldn't play a note and the children so love singing. The schoolhouse has a small organ, you know." "I didn't, but I'm pleased to hear it," Caroline said. "Music is very important for developing young minds." As the conversation continued, Caroline noticed Dusty speaking with Sheriff Tate a short distance away. The sheriff looked serious, and Dusty's expression grew increasingly grim. After a few minutes, Dusty excused himself and made his way back to Caroline's side. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly when there was a lull in her conversation with the Thompsons. Dusty's jaw tightened slightly. "Sheriff's got word the last bandit from the stagecoach robbery is holed up in the hills. He's forming a posse to go after him tomorrow. And he wants you to join. Asked me to help, yes." Dusty's eyes met hers. "I should go. That man took your things, threatened your life." Caroline felt a chill despite the warm day. "Will it be dangerous?" "Could be," Dusty admitted. "These men don't generally surrender peacefully." A knot of worry formed in Caroline's stomach. She'd known Dusty James less than a week, and yet the thought of him riding into danger disturbed her more than she cared to admit. "Please be careful," she said softly, his expression softened. "I will." Then, changing the subject, he asked, "Would you like to walk a bit? It's a fine day, and I thought you might enjoy seeing more of the town." Grateful for the distraction, Caroline nodded. They excused themselves from the Thompsons and made their way toward the edge of the church grounds. The main street of Willow Creek was quiet on Sunday, most businesses closed for the day of rest. Dusty led Caroline past the buildings. She'd already seen the general store, the bank, the hotel, and continued to the outskirts of town where homes gave way to open country. "It's beautiful here," Caroline observed, taking in the rolling hills and distant mountains. "So different from Boston." "Never been to Boston," Dusty admitted. "Never been east of the Mississippi, truth be told." "You've lived in Texas all your life," he nodded. "Born about 50 miles from here. Parents moved to Willow Creek when I was 10, been here ever since except for during the war." Caroline hesitated before asking, "You fought for the Confederacy, did?" Dusty confirmed, his expression guarded. "Not proud of everything that happened in that war, but I did what I thought was right at the time." Caroline appreciated his honesty. The war had ended 11 years ago, but its echoes still resonated, particularly in border states like Texas. "My father was a Unionist," she said carefully. "But he always said brave men fought on both sides." Dusty seemed to relax slightly. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Caroline smiled at the memory. "He taught mathematics at a boys' school in Boston. He's the reason I became a teacher." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, eventually turning back toward town. As they approached the boarding house, Dusty slowed his pace. "Caroline," he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words. "Yes. I'd like to call on you properly when I return from this posse business. If that would be agreeable to you." The formal request took Caroline by surprise, though not unpleasantly. Yes, that would be agreeable." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the hills. "Good, that's good." As they reached the boarding house steps, Caroline turned to face him. "Dusty, please be careful tomorrow. These men sound dangerous." "I've faced worse," he assured her, though his eyes were serious, "but I appreciate your concern." He tipped his hat and bid her good afternoon, leaving Caroline to watch his tall figure stride down the street, her heart a confusing mixture of anticipation and worry. Inside, Mrs. Peterson was bustling about the kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner. She looked up when Caroline entered, a knowing smile on her face. "Had a nice walk with Dusty, did you?" Caroline nodded, removing her bonnet. "Yes, though he's just told me he's joining the sheriff's posse tomorrow to track down the last bandit." Mrs. Peterson's smile faded. "That doesn't surprise me. Dusty's always been one to step up when needed." She patted Caroline's hand reassuringly. "Don't you worry too much, dear. He knows what he's doing." Despite Mrs. Peterson's reassurance, Caroline did worry. All through the afternoon and evening, her thoughts kept returning to Dusty riding into potential danger. It seemed absurd to be so concerned about a man she'd known for such a short time, and yet she couldn't help herself. That night, as she prepared for bed, Caroline opened her trunk and pulled out her journal. She hadn't written in it since before the stagecoach robbery, and there was much to record. As she wrote about her arrival in Willow Creek, her encounter with Dusty on the church steps, and the events of the past few days, Caroline was struck by how much had happened in such a short time. When she reached the part about Dusty joining the posse, her pen hesitated above the page. What exactly was Dusty James to her? A friend, certainly. A potential suitor, perhaps, but there was something more, something she couldn't quite articulate even in the privacy of her journal. All she knew was that the thought of him in danger made her heart clench with fear, and the memory of his smile made it flutter with hope. Whatever this feeling was, it was too new and fragile to name, but too powerful to ignore. Caroline closed her journal and extinguished her lamp. Tomorrow she would focus on preparing for the start of school, which was now only a week away. and she would pray for Dusty's safe return. The posse left at dawn on Monday. Caroline, unable to sleep, watched from her window as a group of 7 men, Dusty among them, rode out of town. She couldn't make out his features clearly in the early morning light, but she recognized his tall figure and the way he sat his horse. After breakfast, Caroline forced herself to focus on practical matters. She went to the schoolhouse with a list of supplies she needed to purchase from Mr. Thompson's store. As she was making notes at the teacher's desk, the door opened and a young woman entered. "Miss Newsom, I'm Sarah Bailey, the doctor's daughter." The young woman, perhaps 20 years old, smiled shyly. "Papa said you might need help getting the schoolhouse ready for next week." "That's very kind of you, Sarah," Caroline said, grateful for the distraction. "I was just making a list of things we need." Sarah proved to be a willing helper, and together they spent the morning cleaning the schoolhouse thoroughly, washing windows, sweeping floors, and organizing books. As they worked, Sarah chatted about the town and its inhabitants, inadvertently providing Caroline with useful information about her future students. "Tommy Wilson is smart as a whip with numbers, but he hates reading out loud," Sarah confided as they dusted the bookshelves. "And the Miller twins, well, don't ever seat them together unless you want constant mischief." Caroline listened attentively, grateful for these insights. "What about the older students? Mrs. Peterson mentioned some only attend when farm work allows." "That's right. The Buchanan boys and Jim Parker only come regular in winter. They're good boys, though not troublemakers." Sarah hesitated, then added, "Most of the older ones are boys. Girls tend to stop schooling earlier around here." "I hope to change that," Caroline said firmly. "Education is just as important for girls." Sarah's expression brightened. "I think so too. I wanted to keep learning, but after our last teacher left, there wasn't anyone to teach the advanced subjects." "What subjects interest you most?" Caroline asked, sensing an opportunity. "Literature and science," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Papa lets me read his medical books sometimes, but I wish I understood more about anatomy and physiology." An idea formed in Caroline's mind. "Sarah, would you be interested in assisting me sometimes? You could help with the younger children, and in return, I could provide advanced instruction in the subjects that interest you." Sarah's eyes widened. "Really? You do that? Of course. A good teacher never stops learning, and neither should anyone else who desires knowledge." By midday, they had made significant progress on the schoolhouse and finalized a list of necessary supplies. As they walked to the general store together, Caroline found herself genuinely smiling for the first time that day, her worry about Dusty temporarily set aside. Mr. Thompson was generous with school supplies, providing chalk, slates, pencils, and paper at the town's expense. "Education's an investment in our future," he declared as he assembled the items. "Anything else you need, just let me know." Caroline was touched by the community's support. In Boston, she had taught at a girls' academy where resources were plentiful but often taken for granted. Here in Willow Creek, education was clearly valued as precious. After completing her errands, Caroline returned to the boarding house, where Mrs. Peterson was preparing a special dinner. "The school board members are coming this evening," she explained. "Thought it would be nice for you to meet them all together in a more relaxed setting before school starts." "That's very thoughtful," Caroline said, offering to help with the preparations. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, Caroline found herself glancing occasionally out the window. Though she knew the posse wouldn't return so soon, Mrs. Peterson noticed. "They likely won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest," she said gently. "These things take time, especially in rough country." "I know," Caroline sighed. "It's foolish to worry so much." "Not foolish at all," Mrs. Peterson corrected. "It's natural to be concerned about people we care for." Caroline looked up sharply. "I hardly know Mr. James." "Sometimes time isn't the measure of such things," Mrs. Peterson said wisely. "My late husband proposed after knowing me just 2 weeks. We had 42 good years together before he passed." The dinner with the school board was a success. In the comfortable setting of Mrs. Peterson's dining room, Caroline was able to discuss her teaching philosophy and plans for the curriculum. The board members were supportive and offered useful suggestions about local needs and expectations. Most important thing is reading, writing, and arithmetic, Mr. Garrett from the bank emphasized. But we don't want to neglect history and geography either. These children need to know about the wider world. I couldn't agree more, Caroline assured him. A well-rounded education is essential. As the evening concluded, Reverend Walsh offered a prayer for the safe return of the posse, a reminder that brought Caroline's concerns flooding back. She retired to her room earlier than usual, hoping that sleep would make the time pass more quickly until Dusty's return. Tuesday dawned with no news of the posse. Caroline kept herself busy helping Annie with household chores in the morning, then returned to the schoolhouse in the afternoon to continue preparations. Sarah joined her again, and together they created a schedule for the school day and organized materials for different age groups. By Wednesday, concern about the posse was spreading through town. They had been expected back by now, and their continued absence suggested trouble. Sheriff Tate's deputy, a young man named Ned, maintained that delays were common in such operations, but his reassurances didn't entirely convince anyone. Caroline was hanging a map of the United States on the schoolhouse wall when she heard horses on the street. Dropping what she was doing, she rushed to the window. A group of riders was approaching, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Her heart lurched as she counted only 6 men, not the 7 who had departed. And one rider was slumped in his saddle, clearly injured. Without thinking, Caroline ran outside, Sarah close behind her. As the riders drew nearer, she scanned their faces anxiously. Relief flooded through her when she spotted Dusty among them, apparently unharmed, but the injured man. "It's Jim Buchanan," Sarah whispered beside her. "He farms north of town." The riders stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Dusty and another man were helping Jim Buchanan dismount when they noticed Caroline and Sarah. "Sarah, run and get your father," Dusty called. "Jim's been shot in the shoulder." As Sarah hurried off, Dusty approached Caroline, his face grimy with dust and stubble shadowing his jaw. "Miss Newsom," he greeted her, his voice rough with fatigue. "You're all right?" Caroline asked, her eyes searching his face. "I'm fine," he assured her. "Jim took a bullet, but Doc Bailey should be able to fix him up." "And the bandit?" Dusty's expression hardened. "Dead. He opened fire when we found his hideout, wouldn't surrender." Caroline nodded, unsure what to say. She was relieved that Dusty was safe, grateful that no one on the posse had been killed, but sorry that the confrontation had ended in more violence. "You look tired," she said finally. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. 3 days in the saddle will do that." "Go home and rest," Caroline urged. "You've done your part." He shook his head. "Need to make my report to the sheriff first and see that Jim's taken care of." His sense of duty was admirable if frustrating in the moment. Caroline wanted to insist, to take his arm and lead him somewhere he could sit down, but she recognized it wasn't her place. Not yet, anyway. "At least come to dinner at the boarding house tonight," she said instead. "Mrs. Peterson always makes plenty." Dusty's smile widened slightly. "That's an invitation I won't refuse. Thank you." Dr. Bailey arrived then, hurrying toward the injured man. Dusty excused himself to help, and Caroline reluctantly returned to the schoolhouse to finish hanging the map. By dinner time, word of the posse's return had spread throughout town, along with the news that Jim Buchanan would recover, and the last bandit from the stagecoach robbery was dead. There was a sense of closure, of justice served, though Caroline felt more relief than satisfaction. Dusty arrived at the boarding house promptly at 6, freshly bathed and shaved, though still looking weary. Mrs. Peterson welcomed him warmly, ushering him to a seat at the table between Caroline and Annie. Throughout the meal, Dusty answered questions about the posse's mission, though he kept the more violent details vague out of respect for the ladies present. Caroline noticed that his normally hearty appetite seemed diminished and dark circles shadowed his eyes. After dinner, Mrs. Peterson suggested that Annie help her with the dishes, a transparent attempt to give Caroline and Dusty some privacy. They moved to the front porch, where rocking chairs offered a view of the quiet street as twilight settled over Willow Creek. "You should be home resting," Caroline said as they sat down. "Probably," Dusty agreed, "but I wanted to see you." The simple honesty of his statement warmed her. "I was worried about you." "I noticed," he said, his tired eyes crinkling at the corners. "Saw you watching from your window when we rode out." Caroline felt her cheeks flush. "Was I that obvious? Only to someone who was looking for you too." Dusty's expression grew more serious. "Caroline, I know we haven't known each other long, but these past few days, all I could think about was getting back here. To you." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Caroline's heart quickened. Back in Boston, Edward had wooed her with flowery phrases and elaborate compliments that, in retrospect, had been as hollow as his promises. Dusty's straightforward words carried more weight than all of Edward's poetry. "I thought about you too," she admitted softly. "More than I probably should have." Dusty reached across the space between their chairs, his hand finding hers. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong around her fingers. "I meant what I said about calling on you properly," he said. "I'd like to court you, Caroline, if you're willing." Caroline looked at their joined hands, then up into his earnest blue eyes. "I am willing," she said, the words coming easily. "But Dusty, I should tell you I came to Willow Creek partly to escape a broken engagement in Boston. I'm cautious now." Dusty nodded, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Understandable. We can take things slow, get to know each other right." The simple acceptance in his response confirmed what Caroline already sensed about him, that Dusty James was a man of patience and integrity, not given to hasty promises or fleeting passions. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand. "Now, you really should go home and get some proper rest." He chuckled, reluctantly releasing her hand. "Yes, madam, teacher's already giving orders, I see." As he stood to leave, Caroline rose as well. "Dusty," she said, suddenly shy, "I'm glad you're safe." He looked down at her, his expression softening. For a moment she thought he might lean down to kiss her, and part of her hoped he would. Instead, he gently touched her cheek, a gesture so tender it almost undid her. "Good night, Caroline," he said quietly. "I'll see you soon." She watched him walk down the street until his figure disappeared into the gathering darkness, her heart full of a feeling she was finally ready to name: hope. The remaining days before school began passed in a blur of preparation. Caroline finished organizing the schoolhouse, met more of her future students and their parents, and completed the sewing of her new wardrobe with Mrs. Peterson and Annie's help. Dusty called on her formally on Friday evening, taking her for a walk around town as the summer sun lingered on the horizon. He told her more about his small ranch, about his hopes to expand it someday, and listened attentively as she shared stories of her life in Boston and her teaching experiences. On Sunday, they attended church together again, this time with Caroline feeling much more a part of the community than a stranger. Several children approached her after the service, eager to tell teacher that they were excited for school to begin. And then, suddenly, it was Monday morning, the first day of school. Caroline woke before dawn, both nervous and excited. She dressed carefully in one of her new dresses, a practical blue cotton with white collar and cuffs, and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style. At breakfast, Mrs. Peterson presented her with a shiny red apple. "For the teacher's desk," she explained with a wink. "It's tradition." Caroline placed the apple on her desk when she arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before the students were due. She checked everything one last time: books arranged on shelves, slates and chalk ready, her lesson plans organized. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Dusty standing there, hat in hand, a small bouquet of wildflowers extended toward her. "Thought you might like these for your first day," he said, looking almost bashful, "for your desk." Caroline accepted the flowers, touched by his thoughtfulness. "They're beautiful, thank you. Picked them this morning," he admitted. "Not much, but I wanted to wish you luck." "It's a perfect gift," Caroline assured him, finding a jar to use as a vase. She placed the colorful wildflowers next to the apple on her desk, where they brightened the entire room. Dusty lingered for a moment. "You nervous?" "A little," Caroline confessed. "First days are always challenging." "You'll do fine," he said with such conviction that she couldn't help but believe him. "These kids are lucky to have you as their teacher." He left shortly after, not wanting to be present when the students arrived. Caroline watched through the window as he crossed paths with the first children approaching the schoolhouse, greeting them with friendly words that made them smile. By 8 o'clock, 18 students ranging from 6 to 16 had filled the desks. Caroline stood before them, momentarily overcome by the responsibility she was undertaking. These children's education was in her hands, their futures shaped, in part, by what she would teach them. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm Miss Newsom, and I'm very pleased to be your teacher." As the day progressed, Caroline's confidence grew. The children were generally well-behaved, if curious about their new teacher. She administered simple tests to assess their knowledge levels, organized them into appropriate groups, and began establishing the routines that would structure their school days. By the time the final bell rang at 4 o'clock, Caroline was exhausted but satisfied. The first day had gone well, with only minor disruptions and no serious discipline problems. The children filed out, many calling goodbye or lingering to ask questions about tomorrow's lessons. After the last student departed, Caroline sank into her chair, allowing herself a moment of relief. She had done it, successfully navigated her first day as Willow Creek schoolteacher. She was gathering her things to leave when the door opened. Dusty stood there, hat in hand once again. "Thought you might appreciate an escort home," he said, his eyes taking in her tired but happy expression. "Successful day." "Very," Caroline confirmed, collecting her shawl and the empty jar that had held her lunch. "The children are eager to learn, which makes teaching them a joy." As they walked toward the boarding house, Dusty asked specific questions about her day, what subjects she had covered, which students seemed most advanced, what challenges she had faced. His genuine interest warmed her heart. Edward had never shown the slightest curiosity about her teaching. "You really care about education," she observed as they neared the boarding house. Dusty nodded. "Didn't get much schooling myself, had to work the ranch after my pa got sick. Always regretted not learning more." He glanced at her. "That's why what you're doing is so important. Giving these kids chances I never had." Caroline felt a rush of affection for this man who understood the value of her work, who supported it not just with words but with genuine appreciation. At the boarding house steps, Dusty paused. "I was wondering if you might join me for a picnic this Saturday. Weather's supposed to be fine, and there's a pretty spot by the creek I'd like to show you." "I'd love to," Caroline replied, her fatigue forgotten in the pleasure of anticipation. Dusty's smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'll pick you up at noon, then." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Caroline to watch his retreating figure with a growing certainty that Dusty James was unlike any man she had ever known, and that her feelings for him were deepening with each passing day. The first week of school established a pattern. Each morning, Caroline arrived early to prepare for the day's lessons. Each afternoon, Dusty appeared to walk her home, listening to her stories about the students' progress and offering insights about the children he'd known since their births. By Friday, Caroline felt fully integrated into the life of Willow Creek. She knew all her students by name, had established positive relationships with their parents, and had even begun the advanced lessons she'd promised Sarah Bailey, who proved to be an excellent assistant with the younger children. Saturday's picnic was a delight. Dusty arrived at noon with his wagon, a basket of food prepared by Mrs. Peterson, and a blanket for them to sit on. He drove them to a peaceful spot beside Willow Creek itself, where the water burbled over stones and tall trees provided dappled shade. As they ate the simple but delicious meal, fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, Caroline felt more relaxed than she had in months. Dusty was easy company, neither demanding conversation nor allowing uncomfortable silences. They talked about books they had read, places they had seen, and dreams they still harbored. "I never thought I'd leave Boston," Caroline admitted as they sat side by side, watching the creek flow past. "It was all I knew, but now I can't imagine going back." "Glad to hear that," Dusty said quietly. "Willow Creek's better with you in it." He reached for her hand then, his fingers intertwining with hers. The simple touch felt more intimate than any of Edward's embraces had ever been. "Dusty," Caroline began, then hesitated, gathering her courage. "I should tell you about Edward, my former fiancé." Dusty squeezed her hand encouragingly. "If you want to." She did want to, she realized. Wanted Dusty to understand why she had come to Willow Creek, why she was sometimes cautious with her heart. "We were engaged for 6 months," she explained. "He was from a good family, well-educated, charming. Everyone thought we were perfectly matched." She paused, the memory still painful despite the distance of time and miles. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he had been involved with another woman, had been for most of our engagement." Dusty's hand tightened around hers. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "The worst part wasn't even the betrayal," Caroline continued. "It was realizing I didn't really know him at all, that the man I thought I was going to marry was a fiction." "Must have been hard to trust again after that," Dusty observed. "Yes," Caroline turned to look at him directly, "but I'm finding it easier than I expected. With you." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Dusty's blue eyes searched hers, and whatever he saw there seemed to resolve something for him. "Caroline," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "May I kiss you?" Her heart fluttered at the request, so formally asked yet so deeply desired. "Yes," she whispered. Dusty leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to change her mind if she wished. But Caroline had no doubts, not anymore. When his lips met hers, gentle and warm, she felt as though something that had been broken inside her was finally beginning to heal. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise rather than a demand. When Dusty drew back, his eyes were filled with an emotion that made Caroline's breath catch. "I'm falling in love with you, Caroline Newsom," he said quietly. "Have been since I found you on those church steps." The words should have frightened her, coming so soon after they'd met. But Caroline knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that what she felt for Dusty was real in a way her feelings for Edward had never been. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the hills. "Then we're both fortunate people." They spent the remainder of the afternoon by the creek, talking, occasionally sharing soft kisses and simply enjoying each other's presence. When Dusty finally returned Caroline to the boarding house, Mrs. Peterson took one look at their glowing faces and smiled knowingly. "Had a nice picnic, did you?" she asked innocently. "Very nice," Caroline replied, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. That night, as Caroline prepared for bed, she found herself humming a tune she couldn't quite place. She felt lighter somehow, as though a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, Caroline wrote a letter to her aunt in Boston, the only family she had left. She described the town, her students, the kindness of people like Mrs. Peterson. And she mentioned Dusty, though she kept her description of him relatively brief, knowing it was too soon to explain the depth of her feelings. As September gave way to October, the days grew shorter and cooler. The school continued to thrive under Caroline's guidance. Several parents commented on their children's improved reading skills or newfound interest in geography. Sarah Bailey was progressing rapidly in her advanced studies, particularly in science. Caroline and Dusty's courtship blossomed as well. He called on her regularly, taking her for walks, bringing her small gifts, a book of poetry, a pressed wildflower, once even a kitten from a litter born in his barn, which Mrs. Peterson graciously allowed Caroline to keep, declaring that every boarding house needed a good mouser. They attended church together each Sunday, shared meals with friends, and sometimes simply sat on the boarding house porch in the evenings, talking or reading together in comfortable silence. By late October, it was commonly understood throughout Willow Creek that Miss Newsom and Dusty James were courting seriously. There were a few raised eyebrows at the speed of their attachment, but most townspeople approved of the match. Dusty was well respected, and Caroline had quickly become a valued member of the community. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, Dusty invited Caroline to visit his ranch for the first time. "Thought you might like to see where I live," he said almost shyly. "It's not much, but it's home. Mrs. Peterson, serving as Caroline's de facto chaperone, agreed that it was perfectly proper for Caroline to visit, provided they returned well before dark. "Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "it's about time you saw what you might be getting yourself into, my dear." The ranch was about 3 miles outside town, a modest but well-maintained property with a small clapboard house, a sturdy barn, and several outbuildings. A corral near the house held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grassland. "It's lovely," Caroline said sincerely as Dusty helped her down from the wagon. The setting was peaceful, with views of the distant hills and the open sky that seemed to go on forever. "Been in my family since before the war," Dusty explained, leading her toward the house. "Not the biggest spread around, but the land's good." The house was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It was sparsely furnished but scrupulously clean, with a few touches that spoke of care. A colorful quilt on the rocking chair, a vase of dried flowers on the table, bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes. "My mother made that quilt," Dusty said, noticing Caroline's admiring glance. "And the books were my father's. He loved reading, especially history." Caroline ran her fingers along the book spines, noting titles on the Civil War, ancient Rome, and exploration of the American West. "He had varied interests." "He did," Dusty agreed, a fond smile touching his lips. "Used to read aloud to me and my brother every night, even after we were old enough to read for ourselves. Said it was important to share knowledge." "A wise man," Caroline observed. "No wonder you value education so highly." Dusty showed her the rest of the property, the vegetable garden he maintained, the chicken coop, the barn with its stalls for horses and storage for hay. 2 ranch hands, brothers named Pedro and Miguel, lived in a small cabin nearby and handled much of the daily cattle work. "They're good men," Dusty said. "Been with me since after the war, couldn't run this place without them." As they walked back toward the house, Dusty suddenly seemed nervous, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture Caroline had come to recognize. "There's something else I wanted to show you," he said, leading her to a small rise behind the house. At the top stood a large oak tree, its branches spreading wide to create a natural canopy. Beneath it, Dusty had set up a small table with a checkered cloth, 2 chairs, and what appeared to be afternoon tea. "Mrs. Peterson helped," he admitted when he saw Caroline's surprised expression. "Thought it might be nice to have tea under my favorite tree." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Caroline deeply. This strong, capable man had arranged a tea party because he knew she enjoyed such refined touches from her Boston life. "It's perfect," she said, squeezing his hand. "Absolutely perfect." They sat beneath the oak tree, drinking tea from Dusty's mother's china cups and eating the cookies Mrs. Peterson had provided. The view from the rise was spectacular, rolling grasslands stretching toward distant hills, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. "I come up here sometimes to think," Dusty said, his gaze on the horizon, "or to remember. My parents are buried over there." He nodded toward a small fenced area with 2 markers visible. "Someday I hope to be laid to rest beside them, but not for many years yet." There was something in his tone that made Caroline look at him closely. "Dusty, is everything all right?" He turned to her, his blue eyes serious. "Caroline, I brought you here today for a reason. Wanted you to see my home, my life, before I asked you something important." Caroline's heart began to race as Dusty stood, then, to her astonishment, knelt before her chair. From his pocket he withdrew a small box. "I know it hasn't been long," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "And if you think it's too soon, I'll understand, but I love you, Caroline Newsom. Have from the first moment I saw you, and I'd be honored if you'd agree to be my wife." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl, elegant in its understated beauty. "It was my mother's," Dusty explained. "My father gave it to her when they became engaged. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right woman to wear it again." Caroline looked from the ring to Dusty's earnest face, her heart so full she could barely speak. 6 months ago, she had been devastated by Edward's betrayal, convinced she would never trust her heart to another man. Now, kneeling before her was a man who had shown her nothing but kindness, respect, and genuine love from the moment they met. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy filling her eyes. "Yes, Dusty, I'll marry you." His face transformed with happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her all along. Dusty rose, drawing Caroline to her feet and into his arms. Their kiss was deeper than the gentle ones they had shared before, filled with promise and passion and the certainty of a future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dusty rested his forehead against hers. "You've made me the happiest man in Texas, Caroline Newsom, and you've given me a second chance at happiness I never expected to find," she replied softly. "I love you, Dusty James." They returned to town just before sunset, their faces glowing with joy. Mrs. Peterson took one look at the ring on Caroline's finger and enveloped them both in a warm embrace. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "Didn't I tell you, Annie? I said he wouldn't let her come back without a proposal." News of their engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek. The next day at church, they received congratulations from virtually the entire congregation. Reverend Walsh himself blessed their engagement during the service, causing Caroline to blush and Dusty to stand a little straighter with pride. "When's the wedding to be?" Mrs. Thompson asked as they mingled after the service. Caroline and Dusty exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed timing yet. "We thought perhaps Christmas," Dusty said, looking to Caroline for confirmation. "If that suits you, darling." The endearment, spoken publicly for the first time, sent a warm flush through Caroline. Christmas would be perfect, she agreed, and so it was decided. Caroline Newsom and Daniel Dusty James would be married on Christmas Day, 1876, in the Willow Creek church where they had first met. The following weeks were filled with preparations. Caroline continued teaching, but her evenings were often occupied with wedding plans. The women of Willow Creek rallied around her, offering help with everything from her wedding dress to the reception that would follow the ceremony. "You'll need a proper trousseau," Mrs. Peterson declared. "Can't send you to your husband's home unprepared." Caroline blushed at the implication but accepted the help gratefully. With Sarah and Annie's assistance, she began sewing linens, nightgowns, and the special garments a bride would need. Dusty, meanwhile, was busy making improvements to his house. He added a second rocking chair to the porch, built new bookshelves for Caroline's books, and with the help of Pedro and Miguel, constructed a small schoolroom in one of the outbuildings. "For tutoring," he explained when Caroline questioned this last addition. "Thought you might want to continue teaching some after we're married. The ranch is too far for children to come to the main schoolhouse in winter." The thoughtfulness of this gesture moved Caroline deeply. Unlike Edward, who had expected her to abandon teaching entirely after their marriage, Dusty understood that education was her calling, not merely an occupation to be discarded. As November turned to December, anticipation built throughout Willow Creek. Caroline's wedding was the primary topic of conversation at social gatherings. The school children were equally excited, peppering their teacher with questions about her dress, the ceremony, and whether they would have a new teacher after Christmas. "No, I'll still be your teacher," Caroline assured them. "I'll just have a different name, Mrs. James." The prospect of becoming Mrs. James filled Caroline with joy. Each day, she thanked Providence for guiding her to Willow Creek, for the stagecoach robbery that had left her destitute on those church steps, and most of all, for the kind-hearted cowboy who had filled her hands with bread and her heart with love. One afternoon in mid-December, as Caroline was dismissing her students for the day, she was surprised to see not Dusty but Sheriff Tate waiting outside the schoolhouse. "Miss Newsom," he greeted her, his expression serious. "Could I have a word?" A frisson of alarm ran through Caroline. "Of course, Sheriff. Is everything all right? Is Dusty? Dusty's fine," the sheriff assured her quickly. "It's about the stagecoach robbery back in August. We've recovered more of the stolen property." Relief flooded through Caroline. "That's wonderful news." "Found it in a cave outside of Red Rock. The last bandit must have stashed it there before we caught up to him." Sheriff Tate gestured to his wagon, where Caroline could see several trunks and bags. "Yours is the large trunk with the brass nameplate. Wanted to deliver it personally." Caroline hurried to the wagon, hardly daring to believe her good fortune. There indeed was her trunk, seemingly intact. With the sheriff's help, she unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was just as she had packed it: her best dresses, her teaching materials, her mother's silver hairbrush set, and most precious of all, the small jewelry box containing her grandmother's wedding ring and the pocket watch that had belonged to her father. "I can't thank you enough, Sheriff," Caroline said, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "These heirlooms are irreplaceable." "Just doing my job, madam," Sheriff Tate replied, though he looked pleased by her reaction. "Where shall I take the trunk?" "To the boarding house, please." "I'll need to sort through everything before deciding what to keep there and what to send to the ranch." As the sheriff drove her and the trunk to Mrs. Peterson's, Caroline could hardly contain her excitement. The return of her family heirlooms felt like a blessing on her upcoming marriage, as though her parents and grandparents were somehow giving their approval from beyond. Mrs. Peterson was equally delighted by the trunk's return. "Just in time for your wedding. Now you'll have your finest things to take to your new home." That evening, when Dusty came to call, Caroline showed him the recovered items, including her grandmother's wedding ring. "It's beautiful," Dusty said, examining the delicate gold band with its small diamond. "Does this mean you won't want to wear my mother's ring anymore?" "Of course not," Caroline assured him, placing her hand with his mother's pearl ring over his heart. "This is my engagement ring, and I cherish it, but I thought perhaps we might use my grandmother's ring for your wedding band." "It was my grandfather's originally." Dusty seemed touched by the suggestion. "I'd be honored," he said, kissing her gently. As Christmas approached, the final wedding preparations fell into place. Caroline's dress, ivory silk with lace trim, sewn by Mrs. Thompson and several other ladies of the town, was completed. The church was decorated with evergreens and red ribbons. Mrs. Peterson and a committee of women planned the reception, which would be held in the hotel dining room. The day before Christmas Eve, school dismissed for the holiday break. The children presented Caroline with a handmade quilt, each square embroidered with a student's name and a small design representing something they had learned that term. "So you'll remember us when you're Mrs. James," little Emma Wilson explained solemnly. "I could never forget any of you," Caroline assured them, deeply moved by the gift. "And I'll be back after New Year's, still your teacher, just with a different name." That evening, a snowfall began, unusual for Texas but not unheard of. By morning, Willow Creek was transformed into a winter wonderland, with a light dusting of white covering the ground and buildings. "It's a sign of good fortune," Mrs. Peterson declared as they watched the snowflakes from the window. "A white Christmas for a beautiful bride." Christmas Eve was traditionally celebrated with a special service at the church, followed by caroling through the town. This year, the festivities seemed even more joyous, with the upcoming wedding adding to the holiday spirit. Caroline and Dusty sat together during the service, their hands linked, both acutely aware that the next time they entered this church, it would be for their wedding. Reverend Walsh's sermon was about love and new beginnings, themes that resonated deeply with the engaged couple. Afterward, as they joined the caroling procession through town, Caroline was struck by how completely she had become a part of this community. These people, who had been strangers just months ago, were now her friends, her neighbors, her support system. And tomorrow, with their blessing, she would marry the man she loved. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the snow still blanketing the ground but the sky a brilliant blue. Caroline woke early, a mixture of excitement and nerves fluttering in her stomach. Today she would become Mrs. Daniel James. Mrs. Peterson, Annie, and Sarah arrived to help her prepare. They brought breakfast, though Caroline found she could barely eat. Then came the ritual of dressing the bride, the special undergarments, the ivory silk dress, the careful arrangement of her auburn hair. "Something old," Mrs. Peterson said, fastening Caroline's mother's locket around her neck. "Something new," Annie added, presenting a pair of silk stockings she had saved her pennies to buy. "Something borrowed," Sarah continued, carefully placing her own mother's lace handkerchief in Caroline's hand. "And something blue," Mrs. Peterson finished, revealing a delicate blue ribbon that she wove into Caroline's upswept hair. "For luck and happiness." When they were done, Caroline hardly recognized herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was radiant, her green eyes bright with happiness, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. "You're beautiful," Annie breathed. "Dusty won't be able to take his eyes off you." The church bells began to ring, signaling that it was time. Mr. Peterson arrived with the sleigh he had arranged to transport the bride, its runners sliding smoothly over the snow-covered street. The church was filled to capacity when Caroline arrived. Every resident of Willow Creek, it seemed, had come to witness the marriage of their schoolteacher and the rancher who had won her heart. At the appointed hour, the church doors opened, and Caroline began her walk down the aisle. With no father to give her away, she had asked Mr. Garrett from the bank, the eldest member of the school board, to escort her. But Caroline hardly noticed anything except the man waiting for her at the altar. Dusty stood tall and straight in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes fixed on her with an expression of such love and wonder that it took her breath away. When she reached him, he took her hands in his fingers warm and steady. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he whispered. Reverend Walsh began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. He spoke of love and commitment, of the sacred bond of marriage, and of the community that would support this new union. When it came time for the vows, Caroline and Dusty spoke clearly and firmly, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for as long as they both should live. They exchanged rings, his mother's pearl ring for Caroline, her grandfather's gold band for Dusty. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Walsh concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled at Dusty. "You may kiss your bride." Dusty gently lifted Caroline's veil, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he leaned down and kissed her, a kiss both tender and passionate, sealing their vows before God and their community. The congregation erupted in applause as they turned to face them, hand in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Walsh announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Daniel James." The reception at the hotel was a joyous affair. The dining room had been transformed with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and white candles. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by virtually every household in Willow Creek. There was music, dancing, laughter, and more than a few happy tears through it all. Dusty kept Caroline close, his hand often finding hers, his eyes seeking her face as though he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. And Caroline, in turn, found herself returning again and again to the shelter of his arm, the warmth of his smile, the steady assurance of his presence. As the afternoon light began to fade, it was time for the newlyweds to depart. Their trunks had already been loaded onto Dusty's wagon, which Pedro and Miguel had decorated with ribbons and bells. The entire town gathered outside the hotel to see them off, throwing rice and calling good wishes. Mrs. Peterson embraced Caroline tightly. "Be happy, my dear," she whispered. "You deserve every joy." "Thank you for everything," Caroline replied, tears threatening, "for taking me in, for your kindness." "Hush now," Mrs. Peterson said briskly, though her own eyes were damp. "You'll always have a place in my home and my heart. But now you have your own home to make with your husband." Dusty helped Caroline into the wagon, tucking warm blankets around her against the winter chill. With a final wave to the assembled well-wishers, they set off for the ranch for home. The journey was peaceful, the snow-covered landscape glowing in the late afternoon light. Caroline leaned against Dusty's shoulder, a profound contentment washing over her. "Happy, Mrs. James?" he asked, his arm tightening around her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" "I've never known such happiness," Dusty said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you feel the same." When they arrived at the ranch, Dusty surprised Caroline by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming. A fire blazed in the fireplace, and the table was set for a private dinner, courtesy of Mrs. Peterson's advance planning. "Welcome home," Dusty said softly, setting Caroline on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," she repeated, the word filled with promise. "Our home." Later, after they had enjoyed their wedding dinner and Dusty had brought in their trunks, they sat before the fire, basking in the peaceful culmination of the day. Caroline had changed from her wedding gown into a simpler dress, and Dusty had removed his formal jacket and tie. "I have something for you," Dusty said, reaching behind the rocking chair to retrieve a wrapped package. A wedding gift. Caroline opened it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with her new initials. "CJ. For your thoughts and memories," Dusty explained. "I noticed you write in your journal often and thought you might like a new one to start our life together." "It's perfect," Caroline said, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "I have something for you as well." From her trunk, she retrieved a package of her own. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in shades of blue that matched his eyes, and a collection of Mark Twain's writings that she had ordered specially from Boston. "The scarf to keep you warm on cold mornings, and the book for the evenings by the fire," she explained. Dusty ran his fingers over the book's cover, then looked up at her with such tenderness that Caroline's heart swelled. "Best Christmas gifts I've ever received," he said, "but not as precious as the gift you gave me today yourself." He set the gifts aside and drew her into his arms. Their kiss deepened, passion building between them as the firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. When Dusty finally lifted his head, his eyes were dark with desire. "Caroline," he said, his voice husky, "my wife." "My husband," she replied, her own voice trembling with emotion and anticipation. Hand in hand, they rose and made their way to the bedroom, to the marriage bed where they would truly become one, where their love would be sealed in the most intimate way. And as Christmas night settled over the ranch, Caroline knew with absolute certainty that the hunger that had brought her to those church steps months ago had been satisfied in ways she could never have imagined, not just with bread, but with love, with purpose, with a home and a future alongside the man who had claimed her heart. 5 years later, on a warm spring morning, Caroline James stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching her husband work with a young colt in the corral. At 30, Dusty was in his prime, strong, confident, and still as handsome as the day she'd first seen him on the church steps. "Papa. Papa, look what I found." Their 3-year-old son, Thomas, came running from the garden, his small hands cupping something carefully. Behind him toddled 18-month-old Elizabeth, struggling to keep up with her brother. Dusty paused in his work, leaning over the corral fence to examine Thomas's discovery. "Well now, that's a mighty fine grasshopper you've got there, son. Can I keep him?" Thomas asked, his blue eyes so like his father's, wide with hope. "Better let him go," Dusty advised gently. He's got a family of his own to get back to. Thomas considered this, then nodded solemnly. Okay. He carefully set the insect on a nearby plant, watching as it hopped away. Caroline smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their third child grew. The years had brought changes to the James ranch, a larger house with a proper parlor and additional bedrooms. More cattle, better fences, and the small schoolroom where Caroline still taught local children 3 days a week. But the most precious changes were the children. Thomas Daniel, born 9 months after their wedding, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Elizabeth Ann, named for both Dusty's mother and Caroline's dear friend Annie Peterson, now Annie Thompson after her marriage to the general store owner's son, was fair-haired and green-eyed, with a determined spirit that kept them all on their toes. And soon there would be another James to join their family. The doctor suspected twins this time, given the size of Caroline's belly at 6 months, but they wouldn't know for certain until the birth. "Mama, hungry," Elizabeth announced, tugging at Caroline's skirt. "Is it lunchtime already?" Caroline glanced at the son's position. "I suppose it is. Let's go see what Mrs. Rodriguez has prepared for us." Mrs. Rodriguez, Pedro's wife, had joined the ranch household 2 years ago as housekeeper and cook, allowing Caroline to continue her teaching without the full burden of household management. It was an arrangement that worked well for everyone. "Dusty," Caroline called. "Lunch is ready." "Will you be joining us?" He looked up from the corral, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Wouldn't miss it." As they gathered around the table, Dusty, Caroline, the children, and Pedro and Miguel, who always joined them for the midday meal, Caroline felt a familiar wave of gratitude. Their life wasn't grand or luxurious by Boston standards, but it was rich in all the ways that truly mattered. Love, family, purpose, community. After lunch, while the children napped under Mrs. Rodriguez's watchful eye, Caroline and Dusty took their customary walk to the oak tree on the hill. It had become their special place over the years where they celebrated anniversaries, made important decisions, and sometimes simply sat together in peaceful companionship. "How are you feeling today?" Dusty asked as they settled on the bench he had built beneath the tree. "Not too tired." "A little," Caroline admitted, rubbing her belly where one of the babies, or perhaps both, was kicking vigorously. "But it's a good kind of tired." Dusty placed his hand over hers, his face alight with wonder as he felt the movement. "Still can't believe there might be 2 in there." "Believe it," Caroline laughed. "They're certainly active enough for 2. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, looking out over the land that had prospered under their care. The ranch had expanded, with Dusty acquiring adjacent property when old Mr. Buchanan decided to retire and move to San Antonio to live with his daughter. "Got a letter from Sheriff Tate yesterday," Dusty said after a while. "He's finally retiring. Asked if I'd consider running for sheriff in the election this fall." Caroline turned to him, surprised. "Would you want to?" Dusty shrugged. "Thought about it. I've helped him enough over the years to know the job. But it would mean being in town more, away from the ranch, away from you and the children." "Pedro and Miguel manage the ranch well when you're not here," Caroline pointed out. "And the town needs a good sheriff." "You wouldn't mind?" Dusty asked, studying her face. "It could be dangerous sometimes." Caroline squeezed his hand. "Life is dangerous sometimes, my love. But you've always done what needed doing, whether it was feeding a hungry stranger or tracking down bandits. If you want to serve as sheriff, I'll support you." Dusty leaned over to kiss her softly. "What did I ever do to deserve you?" "You filled my hands with bread when they were empty," Caroline replied simply. "And my heart with love when I thought it was broken beyond repair." Their lips met again. A kiss deepened by years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. When they finally drew apart, Dusty rested his forehead against hers, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished. "I love you, Caroline James," he whispered. "More today than yesterday and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, the words as true now as when she had first spoken them beneath this very tree. Always and forever. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Caroline reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From that hungry, desperate day on the church steps to this life of abundance and joy, it had been a path she could never have imagined. Yet somehow, against all odds, a chance encounter with a kind-hearted cowboy had led to the greatest blessing of her life. Dusty had filled her empty hands with bread and his name, but more importantly, he had filled her days with purpose, and her heart with a love that would last all their days. And as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting golden light across the land they called home, Caroline knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be.